Perform qualitative risk analysis. What is qualitative risk analysis? Take a look at the screen and you can see the traffic lights, the red, yellows, and greens. And what do these mean? Well, this really means that a risk is high, medium, or low. Why do we want to categorize a risk as high, medium, or low? To categorize the risks in order of importance. Those risks that have a high probability, those risks that have a high impact, we want to be aware of them. And the cumulative and overall effect is going to be explored further down in quantitative risk analysis. But for now, what we would like to do is categorize the risks. We want to categorize the risks according to the risk breakdown structure. We could categorize the risks by high, medium, low. And we do this by using something called a risk score, probability rating of the risk on a scale, impact rating of the risk on a scale, multiply those two, and you could get a number. As you can see here, we've got a 16. That is the second highest risk. The highest one is 4 times 5, a 20. So a risk with a higher probability and a higher impact is likely to be on our higher priority list for treating the risks. So our main goal here is to categorize and rank identified risks. Some people may go ahead and decide to do a risk urgency assessment to find out which risks do we need to treat right now. If we don't treat them today, we're going to be in bigger trouble tomorrow. We're going to have a bigger risk, or we won't even be able to run the project. So that's really the main goal of perform qualitative risk analysis. Those high priority risks, those urgent risks, we want to get them to the top, and we want to begin to work on them as quickly as possible. So our main mission here is to analyze identified risks by assigning a risk score and/or prioritizing the risks. So let's take a look at our inputs here. First input is the big plan that tells us what to do, the project management plan. But don't forget, it contains the risk management plan. And the risk management plan guides us on how to carry out qualitative risk analysis. It also gives us an idea about risk categories. The definition of impact scales that we're going to use is also here. The probability and impact matrix. Stakeholder risk thresholds. There's so much information in the risk management plan that makes it very relevant. Now don't forget, we could have additional plans that are relevant to this process, but the main one is the risk management plan. The next input is project documents. Project documents of relevance here could include the assumptions log. You need to be aware of your assumptions. Risk register, of course. Remember, I told you in a previous project to look out for this hidden gem. The risk register needs to be an input to lots of these risk processes once it's created. In fact, once you create your risk register, you see it within the project documents as a sub-input. For me, this is one of the biggest inputs because without your risk register, you really cannot rank or categorize the risk, can you? Last but not least, the stakeholder register is also relevant here because in our stakeholder register, we may be able to glean stakeholders who could become risk owners. Some people say, Phil, I don't have any risk owner. I own all the risks. But on some projects, you do have risk owners. The next input is EEFs, enterprise environmental factors. Think industry studies on similar projects. Think about published data regarding risks from similar projects. And we also have OPAs, organizational process assets. The process assets in question here are those that can influence qualitative risk analysis, and specifically information from previous projects can help us here. Let's talk about the tools and techniques. Expert judgment, of course, expertise in ranking risks, expertise in carrying out qualitative risk analysis, understanding and awareness of what was done on a similar past project is also relevant here. We have data gathering as our next one. Data gathering, we could have interviews. We could have the interviews as being semi-structured or fully structured. And the main goal of the interviewer is to promote an environment of trust. One of the things I've seen in a lot of risk workshops I've done is people hesitating to call out risks, or people hesitating to categorize risks. People feel if they call out a particular risk, they'll be in trouble. Or if they categorize it as high, they'll run into trouble. It's the job of whoever is conducting the interview to put people at ease so they get realistic data. The next tool and technique is data analysis. Under data analysis, we have risk data quality assessment. Now, a risk data quality assessment is exactly as it implies. Assessing risk data for quality. Trying to find out if there is indeed quality in the risk data. And if there's not quality, if it's bogus data, fake data, unreliable data, what needs to be done? The project manager and the team need to start from ground zero, collecting the data all over again, or start from the point at which the data started becoming corrupt. So that's our main goal, to make sure within this risk data quality assessment that the data is realistic, it's complete, it's objective, it's relevant, and it's timely. Still under data analysis, we have risk, probability, and impact assessment. And this is an assessment of each risk to assess the probability on a scale based on the guidelines in the risk management plan, and also to assess the impact on a scale based on the guidelines in the risk management plan. Definitely expert judgment will come into play here using a risk, probability, and impact assessment. One of the things to note with our risk, probability, and impact assessment is the risk score, probability rating times impact rating. If you have a scale of 1 to 5 and a risk probability is a 3, you multiply it by the risk impact, which may be a 4, you get a 12. Now that information needs to be gathered for all the risks, and those risks that come to the top, like I showed you in the example, 20 and 16 were the highest. But you could also have risks that are 1 in terms of the risk score, or 1 times 1 to give a 1, or 2 times 2 to give a 4. But those risks shouldn't be forgotten. Those risks should be put on a risk watch list. Really, your risk watch list is the lower items in the risk register. Those that fall to the bottom, keep monitoring them. Don't forget them. They could become very toxic and dangerous. So it's important that we keep an eye on those lower level risks because they could become really bad. Let's take a look at one more bullet point here. It's a rather important one, and this is under data analysis, and it's assessment of other risk parameters. Now, there are a variety of other parameters to be considered when you identify risks, when you analyze risks, and I talked about risk urgency previously. Risk urgency refers to the period of time within which a response to the risk is needed. It means that if you don't take action on a risk right now, then it's almost as good as not taking any action. It will not be effective when you finally do. So an urgent risk is one in which you need to take action now. We call that risk urgency. We also have proximity, the period of time before the risk may have an impact on one or more of the project objectives. So if a risk is left untreated and it hits a project objective in a few days, that has a high proximity. Or if it impacts the project next week, we could look at that as having a high proximity. We also have a term called dormancy, the period of time that could elapse before a risk is discovered. We have manageability, the ease in which the risk could be managed by whoever is responsible for it, usually called a risk owner. We have controllability, the degree to which the risk owner is able to control the risk's outcome. Detectability, how easy is it to detect the risk? Some risk could be under the radar for a long period of time undiscovered. Where the risk occurrence can easily be detected, we say it has a high detectability, and where it flies under the radar for almost all the project, we could say it has a low detectability. We also have a term, connectivity, used to describe if a risk is connected to many other risks. If a risk is not connected to any other risk, it has a low connectivity. If it has a relationship to many other risks, then we could say it has a high connectivity. We also need to be aware of strategic impact, the potential of the risk to have either a good or bad effect on the organization's strategic business objectives. When a risk has a major effect on the company's strategic business goals, we could say the strategic impact is high. We have a term called propinquity. This is the degree to which a risk is perceived as important by one or more stakeholders. When a risk seems to trouble stakeholders very significantly, we could say the propinquity is high. Where a risk does not seem to be of concern to any of the stakeholders or does not matter to them, we could say propinquity is low. Having an idea of these additional characteristics, I know there are lots of them, but this could help the understanding and perception of risks to better manage risks on the project. The next tool and technique here is interpersonal and team skills. Project manager definitely needs these for facilitation. There's a lot of work to be done. Getting all the data, rallying the troops in qualitative risk analysis. And for that reason, the ability to facilitate a team, to facilitate team efforts, to cut out the waste of time and get down to the bottom of the data that needs to be discovered and discussed. Facilitation is just a huge, huge benefit. Also, the project manager may find him or herself having to iron out any disagreements and to uncover any sources of biases. The next tool and technique is risk categorization. Risk categorization can be done using the WBS or the RBS. These categories that we use to define risks should have been previously defined in the risk management plan. The next tool and technique is data representation. How do we represent the data? Well, we could use the probability and impact matrix. Remember, this is documented in the risk management plan. We could also use hierarchical charts, and hierarchical charts could be used where we have categorized risks using one or more parameters. We could have a chart showing risks by proximity and detectability. We could have a bubble chart showing risks by urgency and propinquity, for example. So all of these categories of risks could be used to show those that are low in proximity, high in proximity, those that are low in detectability and high in detectability. There is an example of a bubble chart in the PMP guide that illustrates this. Take a look at figure 11-10 for a good understanding of how these risks could look in a chart. Last but not least, final tool and technique is meetings, the meeting of the minds. In order to get mileage, folks, you're going to have meetings. I know some people hate them, but we only want to invite the relevant people to the meetings, and we want to cut out the crud and the waste. Go straight to the point. So meetings are very helpful tool and technique here. Now we have a very strange output from this process because there's only one output, and it looks like one we've seen a million times. It's project documents updates. So let me ask you, can you guess which project document should be the first thing to mention here? I'm waiting. Hello? Did you get it? The risk register. You definitely want to put your risk register up front in your head. Now, I know in the world of the PMI, there's so many documents, but the risk register, hey, that's what we've been working on. Now, the PMI, they list out assumptions log, issue log, risk register, risk report, and it's kind of alphabetical, but hey, you want that big ticket item to stand out. The risk register, boom, that one first. And of course, a risk report. You could have an updated risk report after all of this analysis that you've done. Okay? And that concludes our perform qualitative risk analysis process. Big one for your exam. Do not confuse qualitative with quantitative risk analysis. They are two different things. You need to be absolutely aware of the differences. When it comes to qualitative, we're talking about categorizing risks, ranking risks, putting them in groups for further action. We are not talking about money at this point. We're not talking about the cost of the risks. We're not talking about the resource or man hours that are associated with a particular risk. That comes in quantitative. So it's very important here to know what qualitative risk analysis is all about. Yes, it deals with numbers on a scale, but it is qualitative data. Okay? And that concludes our review of perform qualitative risk analysis.